Hello, everyone. I'm Robin Quinville, and I'm the director of the Global Europe program here at the Wilson Center. And I'm joined today by Dr. Kaija Schilde. Dr. Schilde is an associate professor at Boston University. She holds the Jean Monnet Chair and is the director of the university's Center for the Study of Europe. So there is no one better to talk to us today about developments in Europe. She focuses on specifically security issues and the defense industry. And so with everything that is going on, this is the time to talk to Dr. Schilde. We're also delighted to have her as a global fellow with our program here at the Wilson Center. So welcome, Kaija.
Thank you so much, Robin.
So the future of European defense, hot topic these days. It is in all the headlines. And the question, though, of Europe's defense spending has long been a scratchy topic between the transatlantic partners. Putin's invasion of Ukraine seems to have changed the threat perception and had a galvanizing effect, particularly for the NATO summit last year. You see this in a broader picture, however. Talk to us about how you look at these developments.
Great. Thank you so much. I have been watching and looking at the developments in this week, this year, in the last 10 years in European defense and EU defense issues. And I have to say that I find myself being one of the least surprised people about the recent developments. I won't go as far as to say I predicted it, but I do feel unsurprised, actually, by the developments, which have actually been afoot, I would say, since 2014 in defense spending. We're seeing great leaps in degrees of defense spending and commitments. And on the part of the German government, the new coalition taking shape in terms of spending, these things are new. They are surprising in terms of timing, but they are not surprising overall in terms of thinking about the larger trajectory of European security and especially the role of the EU in security. And so the reason why I would say I'm not surprised is because, first of all, I'm a political scientist. That's my training academically. And one of the things that brought me to the study of the EU and security and defense issues around the EU is that I see the EU as almost a laboratory of state formation processes. And so political scientists often study different kinds of institutions and laws and rules and behavior, but a lot of us study actually how states form and fall apart and the different kinds of states there are in the world. And so ever since I was in graduate school 20 years ago, and really getting deeply embedded in the theory and the history of how states form, I really found the European Union to be a very familiar space for that, almost a laboratory of those processes. And so when I say state formation, I don't mean I think the EU is a state or I think it will be a superstate or something. I mean the process, the ways in which power deepens and authority transfers between different sectors and kind of the big thresholds of change there. And so when I first started studying the European Union, I saw it very, very clearly as a place where certain kinds of authority that are part of responses in international relations, are part of high politics, obviously trade and other economic areas, but increasingly defense. I saw it as something, as a place where things would be happening. But the level at which things would be happening, I always thought that NATO probably could not be the only entity responding to European security. And also I had a background, a policy background at the beginning of my career in defense issues in the United States at the Office of Secretary of Defense and in think tanks. And my career evolved from a background in counterterrorism policy to a real specialization in defense reform and acquisition and procurement. And so that is a very long-winded way of saying that I'm familiar with the difficulties around how states generate raise and lower defense spending, generally raise or distribute defense spending, the choices around force planning and how that's made, but also around how states try to match their strategy and changing threat conditions to actual material purchases and like what to buy, what to do. And so with that policy background combined with being a political scientist, I started to focus on the actual security and defense institutions and priorities and processes of the European Union, which 20 years ago were nascent. I was told not to study the topic. I was told nothing would ever happen. And I was also told, why would you study European security? Because it's a place where there are no more security concerns. And so as part of that, I actually started to see the EU through this political science lens as a place where security was, of course, still a concern. I mean, you and I have talked about this before. Many of us have observed this. But also that when security or the security environment changed, that the European states would be responsive to it, and that the EU would kind of inevitably be the place where this conversation around procurement and around capability planning would have inevitably be happening. And then one last thing, because I know we have a lot of other things to talk about, but I also, as part of my studies and research, have had a different perspective on the European Union than a lot of other scholars. Yes, I see it as a liberal project, a way to prevent war inside Europe, but I've also seen it develop and deepen in this increasing authority way, even back in the 1950s around the European defense community, because of changes in the threat environment. I've spent a lot of time in the archives of Jean Monnet, and even though he wrote his memoirs in the 1970s saying, we did the European project to create peace in Europe and for economic growth and wealth, but his notebooks from 1950 and 1951 say the world is getting more dangerous. We're concerned about the Soviet Union. We're concerned about the Korean War, and so therefore we need to create a defense community in Europe. And so big moments of integration, of European integration and the deepening of EU authority have happened because of external threat conditions. And so when 2014 came around and you saw European member states spending more in defense, but there being genuine initiatives that helped the European Union respond to the war in Ukraine in 2022, those were all born out of 2014 and the Russian annexation of Crimea. And so that didn't surprise me. And the developments that have happened in the last week or two haven't surprised me either. So.
I think this is great. We ought to have you on this program more often so that you can tell us what is not surprising you in the future. I remember so well in roughly 13, the head of a major European defense industry producer challenged a room full of policymakers in Germany. Europe's going to need to decide whether it wants a defense industry, right? And what you're saying is that in the next year there was, even with the invasion of Crimea, basically, the change started to happen. It's interesting because I'm not sure people truly saw it over that 10-year period.
Yeah.
And at the 2014 NATO summit, everyone was touting how many countries had managed to move into the 2% range. But that was a fairly recent development. I think what people wonder now is this going to be sustained? And can Europe sustain it? What steps is Europe taking in order to do that? And we saw that countries, when they went into their arsenals to provide aid to Ukraine, found some readiness gaps.
Oh, for sure. So I want to be clear that when I say I see the EU as as kind of inevitably, structurally speaking, where procurement decisions need to happen, where decisions need to happen. I'm not saying, everything's fine, it's all taken care of.
No, I didn't think that.
I just want to make sure that nobody who ever watches this in the future thinks I'm saying that.
I didn't take it that way, but it's interesting that you start there.
Exactly. And so so I also, my background in the U.S. government and attempting to reform defense institutions in the U.S. government made me, let's say, low-key obsessed with bureaucracies and the way they work and, their activities and kind of understanding them, understanding different kinds of ways that bureaucracies are set up, I'm kind of a bureaucracy whisperer in that way. I really understand them. I don't know if I love them, but I really understand them, and I kind of can see different phenomenon happening in them. And so I think that one of the things I have been doing when I'm paying attention to the European Union, and also paying attention to developments inside, say, ministries of defense in European member states, is not just looking at like top-level indicators like defense spending. So, I have written a lot on defense spending in the United States, and what factors go into defense spending changes. And so defense spending is an indicator, first of all. I know that it's very important to the NATO conversation. And I've also been critical of back when it was one of the only indicators, I was quite critical. And I'm pleased that we have other capability indicators to help improve the NATO alliance interoperability and capabilities overall. But I think that paying attention only to amount of spending, percentage of spending is a poor indicator. And so when I'm teaching, for example, this is a little bit of an aside, but really around the NATO conversation, the NATO in terms of European spending and US spending in the year 2000 was at parity. European states spent as much as the United States spent. And of course, what the United States spent is not on European security. It's generally, globally, of course. And the real divergence then it happened in 2001 when the U.S. started to engage in out of European area wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I've always been irritated, not by your question, but by the debate that the U.S. spends more than Europe, because first of all, this is just this is not necessarily about European security, and I think it's a poor indicator in general. So to tie it back though. Defense spending overall takes quite some time to ramp up. It's about quality, not quantity. I mean, of course, quantity can have some quality in it, but those two things don't go together. But I have been watching, for example, what European ministries of defense spent on. And so I wrote an article 5-6 years ago now. I think it came out in 2016 or 2017 saying, hey, at that point, defense spending hadn't rocketed up yet. But if you paid close attention to what the ministries of defense were buying, they stopped their 20-year trend, especially smaller states like Romania or Bulgaria, stopped their 20-year trend of investing in expeditionary equipment to support NATO operations out of Europe and started reinvesting in territorial defense. And so you saw an initial beginning of that in 2009, which I attributed to actually a little bit of a wobble in threat perception around the Russia-Georgia conflict. And then you saw a massive, massive sea change in 2014 in ministries of defense as to what the ministries of defense were purchasing. And again, that doesn't mean, oh, they got enough weapons, they have enough to match European strategic autonomy goals. But the point I was trying to look at is, were they threat responsive? And the answer was yes.
This is so interesting because I think that we too often just look at the overall headline and we're not focused on the capabilities that are being built or the direction of that. So fascinating. The EU has a new defense commissioner, and that defense commissioner is going to issue a report next week with some recommendations. Talk to me a little bit about the importance of this EU defense commissioner and what you expect from them.
So, I saw a news story last week or a few days ago in the Financial Times where the Financial Times saw an advance copy of perhaps what might be done next week in the report. And it's essentially, I know I sound like I predicted something, but again, something I'm not surprised about is that the European Commission may or may not, I may be confirmed as correct next week or not, but I'll blame the FT's reporting or not. But the FT has apparently seen a document that says that the Commission may be the buyer.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, may actually be the procurement actor. And it would either be the Commission or the European Defense Agency, but I don't know the details, right? But this is the kind of centralized authority that, of course, makes everyone anxious because it's such a, I don't want to say violation, but it's such a change in sovereignty, about who's buying what. I mean, that has been at least core to our conventional understanding of modern state sovereignty is that states procure weapons.
The defense decisions are largely
National
decisions,
exactly.
even within the NATO context.
Exactly.
This would be interesting.
It would be, and so I hope that this conversation isn't, completely off base. But on the other hand, even if it doesn't happen next week, I fully expect there to be an EU role, a European institution, European Commission or European agency role in this that goes above and beyond the kind of advisory role that the European Defense Agency has had, increasing, but over the last 20 years, where it has tried to matchmake, have best practices, have codes of conduct, a little bit of joint procurement going up over time. But the problem in Europe is not spending enough. I mean, they're going to spend a lot more now, but what they spend as, collectively is quite large, and it has been redundance and lack of coordination. And so markets don't coordinate themselves. And NATO is not a market actor. NATO, I think, I can't predict exactly what's going to be happening with NATO, but I'm watching this space. But NATO can set standards. NATO can have operational goals and set strategic goals for what kinds of equipment European states might need to spend more on, might need to coordinate, might need to make very difficult but important industrial policy decisions about. But the problem is it's not something that can be coordinated laterally and horizontally. It has to be centrally coordinated. That's how industrial policy works. Picking winners and losers. It is deeply political. And it just is something that requires a certain kind of neutral expertise, because there's going to be a rising tide that lifts all boats with an increase in spending. But the decisions about, say, which helicopter, which missile, which tank, I believe that if it works well, will be very closely coordinated with NATO in terms of standards. But NATO doesn't shape markets. And that is the core EU authority that is already in place over the common and single markets, which defense historically has not been a part of.
I'm looking at this and thinking this will have an impact too on the question of where you buy your equipment from. Do you develop your own capability? And this is the potential for some scratchy transatlantic relations as well, right? If you are going to suddenly institute a Buy European project.
Yes, that's actually the question I was hoping you would get to, because that's really the crux of it all. And so that has been the bone of contention, and it's concerned third party states like the U.S. or recently the U.K., even though the U.K. has been signaled that it's in now, not in the European Union, but it would be in any collaborative weapons projects. And but this is absolutely where the rubber meets the road on these decisions, and I want to say both sides of it. It has been the area of contention, but one of the things I've been arguing for the last few years in some of my more granular policy work and advisory work is that on the U.S. side, I've tried to advise U.S. policymakers to actually have a more strategic and strategic mindset when it comes to European protectionism in defense, whether at the national or the European level, because some of my academic research has shown that you actually states there's a ceiling to what states will spend on defense when they're purchasing foreign equipment.
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so because it's a pure cost, essentially, when it's only imported. And also then, it's not just that it's a pure cost, but if you think of things through a political economy lens, or political economy lens when it comes to interests, there are no interest groups, no constituencies for weapons purchases. So that's traditionally what people call the military-industrial complex, and kind of a negative normative frame. But if you think of it neutrally, that if you're only buying weapons from abroad, or if you're primarily buying weapons from abroad, you have weak domestic constituencies for sustaining spending and for increasing it.
That is so true, and that plays into our own politics as well here in the U.S. So fascinating. So you have given us some indications that you were not surprised, and therefore you looked at these things so you you felt that this was something that you could see coming.
Yeah.
That's why I'm going to ask you a really tough final question.
Okay, great.
All right, and that is, where do you see this 10 years from now?
Oh dear. This is so hard for academics, or I could usually weasel right out of it. But it's a nice question to be asked. I will navigate my way through it. I do not know what end state we're looking at in terms of the EU as a security actor. Like I said, to be careful, when I say I see it through a state formation lens, I do not mean it will be a super state with an army. That's not the kinds of things I'm saying. Exactly. I do think that there will be a European procurement body that will probably layer on top of some kind of coordinated national procurement bodies. I do not think that ministries of defense and national champions and national defense industries will go away. However, I do think that there will be industrial policy and also funded by fiscal spending at the EU level that will rising tide rise all boats. And then there will be politics in the middle, and there has to be really good policy making. But it's the kind of good policy making the EU has been doing for a very long time, managing a common market, right? They've had to have anti-monopoly tough decisions, that are not always great for interests inside states. And so there will be winners and losers when it comes to European defense industries. But with the kind of spending that's on the table right now, that'll also generate a lot of innovation and hopefully a lot of best practices. I guess there's a question of what I'd like to see happen, and that would be probably close coordination between NATO and the EU on operational standards and actually executing the procurement and the research and development around what kinds of capabilities are needed at the European level for European strategic autonomy. And one thing I also think is that there's a little bit of a pathology comparing defense spending to the U.S., comparing like what it takes to have strategic autonomy to what the U.S. has done. And I don't think that's correct, because the question is, what does Europe need? What does it need to make decisions in an autonomous manner about its own security environment, its neighborhood, its interests, its member states? What does it need to do to nurture a defense industrial base that stays in Europe, that is healthy, that has enough profit to be able to take long-term risks about weapons systems? And one thing that I didn't say in an earlier answer, which I kind of want to squeeze in about that, is it's not just all future. The EU has already been doing things that affect the defense industrial base towards a healthier future. And so even though the EU has not yet, we'll see TBD next week, right, directly purchased defense equipment, it has changed the risk assessment of European defense industries and firms. It has, if you ask the firms whether they take more risk in investing in future products based on European regulations, not procurement, but regulations, so they say yes, and it's measurable, and I've measured it, that you see that they spend more of their own money investing in prototypes, investing in innovation, based on the idea that there is a regional body that is handling intellectual property, that's handling standards, and also, back to the point about the U.S., that is also protectionist, that's not letting just anyone participate. And so this is defense industries are not normal industries. They're never really fully open markets, and so they are entities that are able to invest in products and spend that money now if they are more assured that later there will be payoff. Not a guarantee, but because these are very long-term, high-risk, capital-intensive things. And so the little things the EU already does that are regulatory has changed the material environment for European defense industries that has already set them up well to respond to what I see as a huge capital inflow.
Kaija, I want to thank you so much for joining us today with this. I feel like we have peeled back several layers of the onion that were actually hiding some of the things that are trends that are underway and some of the information that we should have. You have helped us to understand what is going to happen, not just next week with this report, but looking ahead into the future. So I hope you'll come back to us at another time and give us another dive into what is going on. With that, I'd like to thank our audience for joining us today with Dr. Kaija Schilde from Boston University.